Hey guys, welcome to the First World History Lecture. Shout out to my wonderful fiance Alyssa, who set up our overview. You're going to see every one of these lectures, and I'm going to have this up so you can see the things we're going to talk about. I might even put up some important information on there. That's our first structure you're going to see a lot. Second, some things I want to tell you when it comes to video lectures, make sure I'm in frame correctly. First, make sure that you are always able to pause a lecture and catch up and write down. So make sure you use that feature well. Grip it and rip it, Liz. What are you drinking? Bubbly, that's right. Water, but flavored. So make sure you pause a lecture and make sure you get down the notes that you're missing. Second, good practice is that if I say a word and then define it, you should also pause, write that word, and define it. It's usually a word I use a lot or I find very important. Third, there might be times I ask you to pause the lecture and do something that is located where the lecture is located. Maybe fill out a map, maybe get some notes down, maybe answer a couple questions just to make sure you're following along in the lecture. So be ready for that. Lastly, you should be taking notes. Make sure you're taking notes either on a piece of paper. I suggest you have some organized system you start setting up, such as separating it by topic or theme or time period, or you can be doing that on Google Docs as well. But it'll be much easier for you to remember, especially on those tests or those writing prompts. It's much easier if you know that information and can connect it already. All right, well, let's get started. So we're going to be starting first. As a reminder, we are starting period 4, 1450 to 1750. And you remember at the very beginning of the year when we started period 4, the first thing we looked at were Gunpowder empires. These were empires that expanded into some of the largest empires we've seen yet in world history. They were mostly located in Eastern Europe, throughout Asia, into East Asia. And they also, of course, were focused in gunpowder. Just as a quick connection, remember back in period 3, we talked about a couple things that opened up the space for these empires. First, the Mongol Empire. Remember, everyone lost to the Mongol Empire. They swept from East Asia all the way into Eastern Europe, destroying a whole bunch of empires and basically all those systems of power that used to exist, leaving this huge open space for other empires to kind of rise up in there. One were the Turkic groups that we talked about. Remember the Mamluks, the Delhi Sultanate, were a couple examples of Turkic ethnic groups that rose up, continued spreading Islam. But then after those groups, we have the rise of our true gunpowder empires. So I'm going to start with first, what were the gunpowder empires? First we have, and if you look at a world map, I'm going from left to right basically. Russia, Ottoman Empire, Safavid, Mughal, and Qing. So first I'm going to start with some broad similarities that they all share. It's something that you might see asked about in an essay, and we'll get into more details as we do deep dives. So basically all these gunpowder empires first used gunpowder to conquer the land that they used to create their empire. Second, once they took that land, how they ruled was pretty similar. In period 3, a big thing that happened in a lot of our empires was decentralization. Especially we talked about that in Europe, but it happened elsewhere. This idea of decentralization of power, that the king or the ruler had less and less power and relied more on lords or warriors or religious figures who actually had almost as much power as kings at times. So this was very decentralized. In period 4, we have centralization of governmental power. Basically, the goal of every one of these empires was to bring in as much power as possible to the king, and that was a constant thing they were trying to do. And they had a couple ways that they did that. First was taxation, taxes. This allowed them to gather wealth from the people in their empire, put it towards government and other things they wanted to spend money on. The second was the use of religion. Often religion was used to say the ruler was in charge, you should listen to what the ruler says. Religious figures were often given high positions in government or paid very nicely. So there's a lot more combination of religion and ruler power. And third was the ruler controlling the military directly. We're going to see a bunch of examples of this, but basically in period 3, a lot of times the rulers had to go to their lords and say, hey, can I please use your military? Will you support me in this battle? Now in period 4, we have rulers who just straight up control the military. If you have the guns, you have the power. Besides that, our last example of something they all did was the use of art and architecture. Almost all of these empires are going to use art, usually pictures of the ruler in a with religious symbolism, or doing something with people from their empire, or the building of huge buildings, both religious and secular, to legitimize. Remember, legitimize basically means to make people want to listen to or follow the ruler. Bless you. With that is our similarities. The next thing we're going to do is deep dive each empire on its own. We're going to do that both today and tomorrow. A good goal for you is that after every time we finish a deep dive, to pause the video, look at what we talked about that empire compared to previous. I'm going to be kind of weaving those in as I talk as well. Screen wipe. As you can see, I've changed the board for the Ottoman Empire. Alyssa did not write it this time. There are some subtle hints in there. So for the Ottoman Empire, we're going to first start with style of rule, and then get into how they centralized power. So in the style of rule, the Ottoman Empire is heavily considered accommodating. As they conquered the people around them and throughout Middle East, North Africa, and into the Balkans, with gunpowder, of course, they were often very accommodating. This meant that the Ottoman Empire often let local religions and ethnic groups keep following their faiths and stay in power locally as a way to kind of make sure everyone wanted to follow the Ottoman Empire. A great example of this system is known as the millet system. The millet system was basically where it stated that people of different faiths, usually Christians and Jews, were allowed to have their own businesses, allowed to continue having their own property, and even follow their faith and follow the laws of their faith, as long as they paid a tax, and as long as they obviously separated themselves from Muslims. But even then, it was common that Jews, when they were kicked out of Christian countries, would move to the Ottoman Empire, as that was a place where they could start a business and be treated fairly. And Christians even often would rather go through the courts of Islam than actually follow on the Christian court. So often minorities, Christians, Jews, view the Ottomans as a very fair rulers. So with that in mind, and as a reminder, Ottoman Empire is an Islamic country founded by Turkish warriors who invaded Anatolia. And that's where we actually want to get into our separations. I just gave you a broad understanding of how the Ottoman Empire was accommodated, but we also want to look at specific areas. We talked about Anatolia, where the Ottomans invaded, converted most of the people to both Islam and to also follow Turkish culture, and turned into like a home for the Turkish people. But elsewhere, the Ottoman Empire is what we consider a minority ruling a majority in a way. In the Balkans, the Ottomans conquered the Balkans, which is almost completely Christian. And in the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire did not really try to convert Christians very much. The Ottomans were very accommodating. They allowed local Christians to stay in power as long as they pledged loyalty to the Sultan, the leader of the Ottoman Empire. And they also often allowed people to stay Christian, of a slight tax, but overall they were allowed to be that way. In fact, only something like 11% of people in the Balkans actually converted to Christianity. In the Middle East, North Africa, while in the Middle East and North Africa people were already Muslim, the big change is that the Ottomans were Turks, while the people of the Middle East and North Africa were Arab. And with that in mind, the Ottoman Empire really tried not to make very many differences between Arabs and Turks. They wanted to emphasize that they're all Muslim, and often Arabs were allowed in government, Arabs were allowed to serve places in high society, similar to Christians and Jews, who were also allowed to hold positions of government and take part in systems of power. So overall, the Ottoman Empire, as a way to keep power, especially in a very large empire, were often very accommodating and made sure that people of different faiths and ethnicities felt like they had a say. Now, when we get to the centralization of Ottoman power, the Ottomans had a couple specific techniques that we want to zone in on. First is our famous devshirme and janissary system. So remember, the one major way that Gunpowder Empire centralized was through control of the military by the ruler. This is a great example. The leader of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, created his own personal army, one of the most well-trained and most powerful armies in the world at the time. These were called the Janissaries. And to make sure this army was completely loyal to the Sultan, he started a system known as the devshirme, which we call the blood tax. This happened primarily in the Balkans. What happens is that the Ottomans would show up around every few years, usually I think it was like 6 or 7 years. The Ottomans would show up. They would take the strongest Christian boys from each village, take them back to Anatolia, and they would convert them to Islam, train them in the newest methods of warfare, and they would be completely loyal to the Sultan, because it was the Sultan who gave them their training, it was the Sultan that paid their bills, it was the Sultan that took care of them. And these Janissaries, though having to leave their families to convert to Islam, got a very high place in society. They received a lot of recognition, and even if they weren't fighters, they often had very high positions in the government. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for Christian parents to try to get their kids chosen to be Janissaries, as it meant that they would become very high levels in society and really make something of themselves. And so this was a system that both provided Christians a way to get very high in Ottoman society. It was also a way for the Sultan to have a powerful military that backed him up whenever he needed. Another important way that the Sultan kept power is through religion. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is Islam, follows Islam. And what the Ottoman Sultan did is that once the Ottoman Empire conquered some of the famous Muslim holy cities, such as Medina, and Mecca. And once the Ottomans conquered a lot of these holy cities of Islam, the Sultan basically declared himself the protector of the faith. He was the guy who was protecting Islam. He was the guy making sure people could visit these holy sites and used as a reason to be like, hey, like I am the person who's in charge because of Allah. Second, and third, last but not least, the Ottomans' use of bureaucracy. Within the bureaucratic system, the Ottomans had a very well set up government, huge, founded by taxpayers who made sure that their whole job was to make sure the Ottoman Empire was running well, government systems were in place, and to make sure that the Sultan was truly the person in power because these bureaucrats served him. And a strong bureaucracy allowed the Ottoman Empire to have a lot more say in state and local officials who had to serve directly to the Sultan. Remember, a strong bureaucracy of people who are government trained and work just for the government really gives the ruler more power. Last but not least, I don't have it written down here, but of course, art and architecture. Architecture, huge bureaucratic buildings and huge mosques built by the Sultan really showed, one, his dedication to the faith by building holy places for people to pray, as well as building large buildings kind of showed like, hey, like I have this ability to make these huge buildings. And then, of course, art. The Ottomans were famous for their miniature paintings, which showed the Sultan often being served by people, like having generals and people bow to him, or had paintings of him winning in battle, showing valor, any way that made the ruler look really good that could be spread out and people could look at. So overall, these were the ways that the Ottoman Empire both kept and maintained power. Last thing I want to state is that the Ottoman Empire is famous as well for their fighting against Christian Europe. But not only that, though, the Christians really viewed the Ottoman Empire as a high-level civilization, something that they needed to copy, something they needed to try to emulate to make themselves better. And there are even times that Christian states such as France would work with the Ottoman Empire against other Europeans. What we're going to see later on in period 5 and 6 is the Ottoman Empire really take part in European politics and slowly start to over time succumb to European power. But that'll be later on when we get to period 5. Overall, this is the Ottoman Empire. Hey guys, I know the board said we're going to do 2 this afternoon, the Ottoman, but the Ottoman, I realized the video was long enough. I'm not going to push it too much on our first video lecture. So Safavid we're going to push tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll do the Safavids and the Mughals. Looking forward for tomorrow then. Bye.